Good afternoon, friends. Good afternoon. Isn't it a beautiful day? Yes. I think Mother Nature knows that the Unitarians and their friends are celebrating today here in Northwest Indiana. Yeah. So she gave us a perfect day. I want to welcome you to the 150 years rededication service of the First Unitarian Church of Hobart. We strive to put love at the center of how we show up in the world. So we start each service with our affirmation of faith. The words are in your order of service. Please join me. Love of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament. Service is its prayer. And this is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Now please silence or turn off your devices, and as you do so, allow yourself to enter into sacred time. Take a deep breath. And another. And join us in the spirit of reverence.
Good afternoon. I am going to be joined by our dear friend, Reverend Bruin, for the lighting of the chalice.
I'll stand.
Please join me. We gather this hour as people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together. And Roger has a special dedication for our church this afternoon.
In the great gray hymnal it is written, rank by rank again we stand, from the four winds gathered hither. Loud these hallowed walls demand, whence we come and how and whither. We are assembled here to write another chapter in the long story of First Unitarian Church. We are here, and by our presence we rededicate this building. A building alone is not a church. Even if it hosts services as this one has for 150 years. A church is a community of souls, a net of relationships with a common purpose, and a shared history with all those who have gathered here before. We light this chalice today to consecrate this building and to rededicate ourselves to listening for those stories that echo from these hallowed walls. A building does not a church make, but properly tended, it can call into being the beloved community in our present and the faithful memory of those who rank by rank have gone before. Let us honor their memories today together.
Thank you, Roger.
The opening words are in your hymnal, number 444. It's a give and take. Please open your hymnals. I'll read the regular script, you read the italic. This house is for the ingathering of nature and human nature. It is a house of freedom, guarding the dignity and worth of every person. It is a house of truth-seeking, where scientists can encourage devotion to their quest, where mystics can abide in a community of searchers. It is a house of art, of parties, celebrations, melodies, and handiworks. It is a house of prophecy, outrunning times past and times present, in visions of growth and progress. This house is the cradle for our dreams, the workshops for our common endeavor. Now please, if you're willing and able, stand for our opening hymn, number 361, in your Enter, Rejoice, and Come In. I'll then afterwards stay standing for the doxology. Thank you.
be seated. And I would invite you, in your settling into your seat, to also allow your gaze to relax, maybe your eyelids to drift shut if you feel comfortable doing that for a little bit of guided meditation. If you'd prefer to just allow your vision to be unfocused and look down, that works too. Just as you settle into other parts of your senses besides your vision, I'd like you to imagine just being in this space 50 years ago, in 1974. What would it have felt like to be in this space? A couple of you were in this space 50 years ago, but whether you were or were not, just cast your mind. Cast your mind into being in this space 50 years ago and what that would have been like. And then let go of that a little bit and push yourself back even further to 100 years ago in this space. 1924. What might have been going on in your life? What might it have felt like to gather in this space? And then drift back to 150 years ago, back in 1874, to be in this room, gathered together, maybe some different windows, maybe some different decorations, but still gathered in here. And then I would invite you back 50 years before that, before this structure was even built, when there was still land here, when there were still people here back in 1824. The sun will still rise and set, the wind blow, the snow fall. And then back 50 years before that, back to 1774, back when this was British land, in the midst of the 60 Years' War, as the sun still rose and set, people still breathed and ate and raised families together. And then 50 years before that even, back to 1724. The sun's still rising and setting, the seasons still coming and going. People still traveling through here. Now I'll invite you to slowly, gently let go of this deep dig into the past. Not as a quick release, but just allowing yourself to drift back here. And as your eyes reopen, your vision comes back into focus at your own pace, just letting the room come to you. This building that hasn't always been here, but has been here for a little while in the scope of history. And maybe for you, coming out of that guided meditation, you might have somewhere within your being that feeling of timelessness that I often feel when I come out of meditation, of just being here, being now, noticing the light coming in the window, having a little different hue than maybe just before you went into that little experience. A little sense of awakening. A little sense of seeing the world differently. The regular rhythm of our lives so often casts a spell on us. The awakening moments start to drift away. We start to see just the sort of the normal push and pull of life, of the bills that need to get paid or the chores that need to get done, and we lose track of that sense of the new hue coming in the window. I've talked in sermons that I've preached in this room and other UU sanctuaries about my experience of growing up UU and drifting away and then coming back as an adult. Coming back because I remembered those experiences of timeless community, of getting to gather with others and dig deep in such a way that the whole world starts to look different. Different hopes and possibilities start to arise. In seminary, I learned that, in the words of John Burns and Rebecca Parker, at the core of the social and political issues that I'd been wrestling with in my drift away from Unitarian Universalism lie competing responses to the classic questions posed by theology. There are so many different ways of putting the UU answers to those questions. One of them draws on the work of UU theologian Rebecca Parker. We are beings that are generous, capable, and connected to one another and to the earth. What is wrong with our society is that the lives of some are being exploited to benefit the others. And we can address this by countering that exploitation and also manifesting a solid sense of enough in gratitude for life's goodness, showing a humble capacity to be part of the web of life. Or another way of putting it into words, UU religious educator Lila Ibrahim, it's a blessing each of us was born. It matters what we do with our lives. What each of us knows about God is a piece of the truth, and we don't have to do it alone. I realized in my late 20s that while I had become very familiar with politics, what was missing for me was religion. As blogger Sarah Robinson wrote, while politics is all about how we're going to make the world better, progressive religion tells us why it's necessary to work for change. We offer the essential metaphors and worldview that everything else derives from, the frames that give our dreams shape and meaning. And this is essential because all around us are frameworks that put at risk the global community of humanity, put at risk the many diverse people who live across this whole earth, put at risk the ecological systems of which we are all a part. Those frameworks make all the difference. If we are given one kind of framework, then we read the story of Adam and Eve being placed in the Garden of Eden as one of humans being placed at the center of everything with the authority to rule, to destroy, to defile. But if we are given another kind of framework, then we can read the exact same story as one of humans being placed among many other beings, their older siblings, with the responsibility to take care of and to be in responsible relationship with them all. The framework makes all the difference. And we Unitarian Universalists don't have to start from scratch. We are the inheritors of a communal theological house built by those who lived, labored, and loved before us, in the words of Burns and Parker. Our social justice hopes have their origins in the ethical teachings of our own religious tradition. They are the same ethical teachings that gave rise to the movement for abolition of slavery and the rights of women in the 18th and 19th century, the Christian social gospel in the late 19th century, that inspired the progressive era in the early 20th century, the civil rights movement, the Roe v. Wade court case that made it possible, that came to the Supreme Court, was made possible because of the activism of liberal churchwomen. And the roots of all of this are older than the fundamentalist movement. This building is older than the fundamentalist movement, which started in 1878. To go back to the roots, there's a section in Genesis in which Jacob is sleeping in the wilderness and he has a dream of angels going up and down. And he wakes up and he says, "Why, the eternal is in this place, and I did not know it." And he says that this is the gate of heaven. not a heaven of some future time after death or some place up in the sky, but the spaciousness of in-between places, of not getting tossed about by the daily pulls and pushes of all the muck that is going on all around us, a place to dig deep, to get perspective, to draw a more centered way of being in the world. While those of us who pay attention to the news hear constantly about the horse race between different candidates, rarely are mentioned the tens of millions of Americans who don't vote at all. While we hear on the news about conflicts between religious conservatives and secular individualists, the vast majority of America's diverse people of faith are not fundamentalists and care deeply for the common good. Through this congregation's involvement in the Interfaith Action Network, we partner with precisely such fellow people of faith. And by virtue of our pluralist welcome, we also welcome into our congregation anyone with whom we can be in productive covenant together, to bring rise to the eternal hope and promise in our world. In the words of Rebecca Parker and John Burens, hope rises. It rises from the heart of life here and now, breeding with joy and sorrow. Hope longs. It longs for good to be affirmed, for justice and love to prevail, for suffering to be alleviated, and for life to flourish in peace. Hope remembers the dreams of those who have gone before and reaches for connection with them across the boundary of death. Hope acts to bless, to protest, and to repair. Hope can be disappointed, especially when it is individual rather than shared, or when, even as a shared aspiration, it encounters entrenched opposition. To thrive, hope requires a home, a sustaining structure of community, meeting, and ritual. Only with such a habitation can hope manifest the spiritual stamina that it needs to confront evil, to endure through trouble, and to hold fast to that which is good. May we forever be connected to that eternal hope.
History, Part 1. 1874 to 1924. The history of the founding of our congregation begins on August 23rd, 1874. But we perhaps need a little bit of a reference point before we begin our journey through history. Where our church building now sits was once part of Hobart Bay, which sat southeast of Hobart Island, all of which was part of what we now call Lake Michigan, which at that time extended down to what is now Route 30. Over the millennia which transpired, the lake receded, leaving us with deep river and deposits of sand throughout the region. That was the very beginning. Hobart was established by George Earle, an English immigrant who sometime in the 1840s settled here on land that he bought from the Potawatomi, who were living here. We don't have much information on the details of the transaction, but we can probably guess that the transaction did not favor the Potawatomi. In 1847, George Earle built a flour mill and a sawmill and built a dam on the Deep River, creating Lake George, which he named for himself. The settlement he established was originally named Earle's Mills, but he renamed it Hobart after his brother Frederick Hobart Earle, who had remained in England. Hobart was platted in either 1848 or 1849, and was incorporated as a town 40 years later. Into this developing community moved several people who would become founders and members of the First Unitarian Church of Hobart. In the years before the congregation was established, From the early 1850s through the early 1870s, efforts were made to establish Sunday schools and develop a ladies' mite society, the goal of which was to sustain preaching in this place and for the moral and the intellectual improvement of society. And of course, being a ladies' mite society, they held bazaars and festivals to get money to provide books for the Sunday school they were struggling to sustain. On Sunday, August 23rd, 1874, a group of like-minded people who had been meeting in homes for some period of time gathered together at a schoolhouse, possibly the one built in 1845 on Center Street, to establish the congregation we worship with today, with these words handwritten in the old membership book. Pursuant to an announcement made some weeks ago, a portion of the citizens of Hobart friendly to the doctrines taught and promulgated by Unitarians convened in the schoolhouse on Sunday, August 23rd, AD 1874. A very able and interesting discourse was delivered by Reverend Carson Parker, after which Mr. William H. Reifenberg announced that the object of the meeting was to effect an organization of society founded on principles taught and promulgated by Unitarians and for the public worship of God. Also, for the advancement of principles of morality and the ultimate good of society in general. After which, articles of association drawn up by Reverend Mr. Parker were presented by Mr. William H. Reifenberg and adopted unanimously. On motion, it was resolved that a board of 5 trustees be elected, which carried, resulting as follows: M.W. Jory, William F. Reifenberg, Carolyn J. Meister, Augustus Wood, and Horace Marble. It was moved that Thomas J. Harrison be elected as treasurer, which carried. It was moved that C.O. Johnson act as secretary for the ensuing year, which carried. There being no further business, the meeting adjourned. Signed by C.O. Johnson, secretary. 48 members were present. By 1870, Hobart was a vibrant, growing community. It was known for its brickyards, and by 1870, it had 4 of them. With 500 residents, it was the largest community in the northern part of Lake County. Before the founding, the future congregants had been meeting in each other's homes, but after the foundational meeting on August 23, 1874, they felt that they needed a more permanent solution to their churchlessness. The congregation began meeting in Stocker Hall, a building that they rented from September 1874 to September 1875, somewhere in the vicinity of 3rd and Main. And early in 1875, while they were meeting in Stocker Hall, they began exploring the possibility of building their own church building and secured subscriptions to the tune of $1,000. They accepted the lowest bid, $1,400, from a builder in Valparaiso, and the building was constructed throughout 1875 and dedicated on January 27, 1876, for a final cost, including furnishings, of $2,600. The dedication ceremony was performed by Reverend Robert Collier of the Unity Church of Chicago, a well-known and popular minister in Chicago. From the dedication of the building to the end of 1878, services were led by a variety of ministers. But in December of 1878, the church was planning to call William Cummings Litchfield to its ministry. Earlier that year, we, here in Hobart, had formed the Indiana Unitarian Conference, with the foundational meeting being held in Hobart late in September. The Ladies' Mite Society had renamed itself the Unitarian Ladies' Aid Alliance, and the American Unitarian Association had donated the last $300 of our indebtedness for the building. The 1860s and 1870s were a busy time for the establishment of other congregations and the building of other church buildings in Hobart. Augustana Swedish Lutheran Church was established in 1862 and built its church building in 1869. First Methodist was established in 1869, and St. Bridget's Roman Catholic Church was established in 1873. Trinity Lutheran was founded a year earlier than our church, and its church building was also dedicated in 1876. Reverend Litchfield was only with us for 15 or 16 months. But during that time, we established a parish library, which at that time was one of the first libraries in all of Lake County. After Reverend Litchfield left in April of 1880, we welcomed a succession of ministers, some staying for brief periods of time, others for longer stints. The historical records I have been looking at for well over a year are not entirely clear on who served when and for how long. But of far greater concern during our first 50 years was the question of whether or not we actually owned the property on which our church building sat. According to one of the histories, we had built our church on a parcel that had been purchased in 1874 for $1 from either George Earl or his brother John. In 1900, John Earl was trying to sell 5-acre tracts for development. He claimed that our deed was forfeit because we didn't have a settled minister and services were not being held on a regular basis. It wasn't until 13 years later, in April of 1913, that suit was brought against John Earl et al. In the circuit court to prevent them from repossessing the land. The case lasted for 2 months, and all the trustees of the church were called to testify. The historical records I have thus far searched say that the suit ended in a compromise, without specifically spelling out the compromise. But it seems that in 1913, during the litigation, John Earl claimed that a deed to the property was given to the church on April 4th, 1877, yes, after the church was built, and that the suit actually dealt with how much property the church owned. The church claimed that it owned the whole block, from Main to Central and from the railroad to Fifth. The Earls claimed otherwise. And in 1913, no deed was ever found. I come to the conclusion of this portion of the history with very little to convey about the period between 1913 and 1924. There is nothing in the historical record. And I suspect that by the time the litigation was resolved in 1913, there were already rumblings out of Europe that presaged what would become World War I. The difficulties for our beloved church were not completely overcome with the settlement of the suit against John Earl. But we need to remember that the historical records of our church contain the names of many pioneers in Lake and Porter counties. John Wood, who was one of the original 48 members present when the congregation was founded, had originally come to Hobart from Massachusetts and had settled near Deep River in 1835. Many of his descendants also became members of this congregation. William H. Reifenberg was perhaps the major force behind the founding of this congregation, and his name was the first one entered into the membership book. His legacy continued beyond his death in 1906, at the age of 71, through the work in the congregation of his daughter, Mary Wood, his granddaughter, Edith Wood Parker, and Edith's husband, Dr. Harry C. Parker. But you will have to wait for the next installment for the years 1924 to 74 to learn how we prevailed. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jenny Peak. I am a fat white woman with long ash blonde hair streaked with gray these days, and I'm wearing a coffee colored dress. Hello, dear First Unitarian Church of Hobart. I'm speaking to you today from California. This is my temporary home where I'm staying for vacation. A storm has been passing through with rain and thunder in this otherwise quite sunny, lovely place. And the place I call home these days is Pocatello, Idaho. And there I serve your sibling congregation as their minister. It is in large part because of you, dear Hobart, that I am in Pocatello serving as minister in this faith we share. I want to thank Michelle and Maggie who included me in your celebration, as a congregation serving Northwest Indiana for 150 years. That is an amazing achievement in a place where I believe our fierce message of inclusion and equity is desperately needed, just like it is in Idaho, by the way. My time in Hobart spanned a brief period from 2009 to 2014, just 5 years, more or less. So in hindsight, we can say your church was a temporary home for me, just like this beautiful cabin in Tahoe is. Because your ancestors founded the Unitarian congregation, and through the decades, they kept it going, about the time that I was seeking, and believe me, desperately needing a loving place to land, you were there. You welcomed me. Something I've noted many times over the years about my time with the Hobart Church is that you were, for me, a learning lab, a place where I could learn to be human in a way that was in keeping with my own values and principles, for discovering how to be in community, how to do that a little bit better as part of a team. From my first Sunday morning there, where Jerry Ashmore greeted me, he told me my Sunday morning options. Thank you, Jerry. Spirit Circle downstairs, first hour on the main floor, and then Emma Hare after that first service, inviting me to a lovely, I believe now defunct little group called Novel Notions at Kathy Arney's house, and to the Faith in Action Committee and the Children's Religious Exploration Committee. Everywhere I turned in your church, it seemed I was wondering, is there a place here for me? And there were all the people saying, sure, come on, you're welcome. Seriously, your church, and more importantly, the people of this church, loved me along my journey. Without you, I would not have developed the courage, the inspiration, or the hope to become a minister. But because of you, I felt safe enough to keep learning and trying and making mistakes and getting up and dusting off and trying again. It's because of you it all worked so well. I remember early on, though, before all of that, as I was coming in, I had a fear, and it was nobody's fault there. It was more my own baggage, my own brand of, what do they call it? Imposter syndrome. I remember many of you maybe have heard, or maybe you've felt that yourself. Well, anyway, that's something I've struggled with. Nothing new there. But I remember as I first started coming to the Hobart Church, I was worrying that I wouldn't be educated enough, smart enough, worldly enough, or even U.S. American successful enough financially to ever really fit in and truly be welcomed. And that's an assumption about a lot of our congregations, by the way. But my fears were laid to rest very early. For me, the Hobart Church was nothing like that, was not going to feed into that mindset at all. And I have a very specific story I thought I'd share super quick. At the church's annual Thanksgiving potluck, so this would be like probably November 2009, the coordinator made an announcement the week before, noting no one had signed up for the very prominently displayed volunteer list of who was bringing what dishes for Thanksgiving. Now, people had signed up, but specifically, she said, no one had signed up to bring a turkey. For meat eaters, it's like the featured dish of a U.S. American Thanksgiving. Yeah, she said in front of, to all of us, she didn't threaten, she promised that if no one brought a turkey, we would eat bologna. That would be our Thanksgiving meal. So after church that day, I went into fellowship hall. I grabbed my mug of coffee, probably, and I see this, sure enough, this big on an easel, this great big sign-up sheet. And there was turkey and a line where somebody's name is supposed to go. And it was blank. It was just blank. And I was staring at it thinking, I know how to make a turkey. That's one thing I know how to do. Oh gosh, but I can't afford a turkey. I can't. I was worried I wouldn't be able to buy my family a turkey if I bought a turkey for the church. So I stood there staring at it, not wanting to say that shouldn't be an embarrassing truth, but it was an embarrassing truth for me at the time, thinking I can't afford it. I would make it, but I can't afford it. Well, along comes another member, and a woman, and she's standing there next to me, and she's staring at the same thing. Only, do you know what she said? She said out loud, well, I can buy a turkey. I just don't want to make it. So the fear was put to rest that somehow I wasn't going to fit in with these good folks. And I made the turkey that year, and the other person paid for the turkey that year. Our deal was struck, and there was no baloney. True story. I realized I was only with you there, at least in body, for 5 years. But what a powerful 5 years it was. In that brief time, you let me bake that turkey. You welcomed me into your committees and your events, and eventually even your homes and your hearts. And through it all, I was able to learn and try and contribute in ways I could feel proud of. I carry those formative years with me today. I carry so many of you still there, and many of you, sadly, who are no longer with us. Your church founders created a spiritual home for themselves and for their children. And on from there, it became a gift to all who would and did come after. I hope it is a gift that you continue to nurture and grow and to give for the generations yet to come. So as my time sharing with you now comes to an end, I can tell you the rain here in Tahoe, also temporary in nature, has passed through. There's a brilliant blue August sky. Everything is looking crisp and fresh and green. And it's leaving a modest mark on my spirit now, the one of peace and solitude and rest. Well, all of these things, whether we're here on vacation or we're there doing the work of the church, or we're in our families, it's the interactions, it's all of it, the details, the storms, the calm, the work, the celebrations. Those are the things that last, that we carry with us. On that note, my heartfelt congratulations to you on this day of celebration. Thank you. Thank you for being there for me. And thank you for being here with me now and always.
Our history, 1924 to 1974. There is very little available in the way of historical documentation for the period from 1913 to 1935, with particular regard to the church. There are no minutes from any board meetings. It's highly unlikely that no meetings were held, and as a matter of fact, we have a report from Dr. Harry C. Parker about an incident in 1926, just 2 years into our second 50 years as a congregation. Let me quote directly from Dr. Parker's report. In 1926, because of a lack of funds and parishioners, It seems that they would have to close the church. Some wanted to sell the church for a funeral home or other commercial purpose. The old-timers preferred to have it torn down rather than be used for such purposes. A meeting was held to discuss this situation, and I was appointed to contact the American Unitarian Association for a loan and the Western Conference for aid. The AUA was unable to help us because of a lack of funds on their own part. Dr. Randall Hilton, Secretary of Meadville Theological Seminary in Chicago, met with us and discussed the situation. The end result was that we would offer to give the church and property to Meadville, with the understanding that we could recover possession if our financial condition improved. During the years that followed our ceding of the church property to Meadville, we were lucky to get additional assistance from Meadville, which supplied us on a regular basis with student ministers, who generally served 1 year in the pulpit. They would arrive on the South Shore from Chicago to Gary, where Dr. Parker would meet them. 3 student ministers, Robert Richardson, Harvey Swanson, and Donald Harrington, preached for 2 years apiece. Donald Harrington went on to become the minister at Community Church in New York City, at that time the largest Unitarian congregation in the country. We also had as our visitor to our church, a young woman minister, Vilma Zanto, who had come from Transylvania on a grant to study and who later married Donald Harrington. Donald Harrington was another important legacy with regard to First Unitarian, and that is having convinced a young student, Nelson Moore, to come preach starting in 1943. His first sermon, The Appeal of the Irreligious, in April of that year was well received, and he continued to preach here regularly. The church was beginning to right itself. The membership was expanding. Although in 1947 the congregation found that it needed to make many repairs to the building, it also found itself in 1948 offering full-time settled ministry to Nelson Moore, who had played a large part in helping to strengthen the congregation. And finally, in 1949, the church had prospered to the point where it could recover the church property from the 23-year stewardship of Meadville. Much work had been done during the years between 1940 and 1950. The cupola needed to be repaired, and at one point the bell tower was closed as it was very unsafe and the floor needed to be strengthened. The complete ceiling in the sanctuary had to be replastered. And in 1950, the clear glass windows were replaced by amber glass. Between 1950 and 1956, we were making plans to build a parish hall. Our plan was to build the basement first and then add the upper floor when we had the money. Our board president had purchased a building on Center Street, back there, and would sell it to the church for use as a Sunday school and parish hall, with the intention of moving that building over the basement. A congregational meeting wholeheartedly approved. In 1953, we asked the Western Unitarian Conference for a $10,000 loan to finance the basement for the parish hall. The basement was dug and dedicated at a dinner on April 28, 1954. At a board meeting several months later, it was determined that the cost of finishing the building would be $6,500. Too expensive at the time of the meeting in July of 1954. The work on the upper floor began in May of the following year, and the Center Street property was sold. And this is one of the most fascinating things. In 1963 and 1964, D. Bruce Clark, an interior designer by profession, presented the trustees with plans and estimates of costs for the remodeling and preservation of our church as an historic landmark. During this time, we had 135 active members. and they agreed with and supported the $25,000 restoration contract, and even threw in the old piano as a bonus for Mr. Clark. It was during this period that this wood on the east wall was installed. In 1965, we purchased the lot east of the church. It is more than a little unclear exactly what that lot represents, but I suspect it may be where our current parking lot is. 2 years ago, the ginkgo tree to the south of the sanctuary, 2 years later rather, the ginkgo tree to the south of the sanctuary was planted by Joan and Jim Davis in memory of Sean Davis. In 1972, a congregational meeting approved the purchase of the building at 437-439 Main Street, where our memorial garden is today, with the intention of renting out the property for income. That property sat just north of our sanctuary, and in 1973, the trustees officially established the Reifenberg-Bracken Parish Library with the intention to collect and maintain a library on Unitarian Universalism and related matters of religious concern for the use of parishioners and members of the community. 1974 brought a bit of sadness. It was the year that Reverend Nelson Moore, who had contributed so very much to the growth and continued health of this congregation, retired from active ministry. And it was also a year that brought considerable joy. We celebrated 100 years as a congregation, and at the service on August 23rd, 1974, 3 sermons were delivered, one by Donald Harrington, who had brought Reverend Moore into our congregation, one by Reverend Moore himself, and the third by Reverend Thomas Wintle, who had been contracted to serve for 1 year after Reverend Moore's retirement. If you're interested in reading those sermons, let me know. I would be happy to copy them for you. Thank you.
Now please rise in body and spirit for our middle hymn, 123, Spirit of Worship.
And
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Armina. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been serving the James Reeb UU congregation in Madison, Wisconsin for 10 years. My family and I attended the First Unitarian Church of Hobart from 2002 until I started my ministry with James Reeb in 2014. I'm grateful to the Anniversary Committee for inviting me to speak today and for prompting me to reflect on how this congregation has shaped me as a minister, as a Unitarian Universalist, and as a human. I became a mom while attending here, and I made friends who journeyed with me through my learning to parent, friends who are still some of the people that I'm closest to today. I heard the call to ministry while attending here, and I learned to understand that call because of the relationship this church had with Meadville Lombard Theological School and its students. I answered that call by going through seminary and the UUA's credentialing process while continuing to find grounding for who I was becoming here. I learned to understand UU paganism and to claim my spiritual identity as a UU pagan here. I also learned to lead in fits and starts and with lots of mistakes through serving on the membership committee and then as co-chair of the worship committee, as a co-leader and planner for the Covenant of UU Pagans chapter that met here, as co-chair of the Welcoming Congregation Committee, and eventually on the board. In particular, I learned about church leadership, about working with other people toward a shared vision based on shared values. That's the surface layer, the things I did while I was part of this community. They were important and sometimes formational experiences. But there are deeper layers of learning that have to do more with how I move through the world and how I locate myself in it as a Unitarian Universalist. I remember attending a membership committee meeting early in my time here. We were talking about how we might engage new members more fully, and someone offered that it was important to remember that people have come and then joined for a wide range of reasons. One committee member in response said something like, "What do you mean, different reasons? We come here to work for justice, don't we? Because UUs are all about that." And I said something like, "Well, actually, I'm not interested in that at all. I'm here to figure out what I believe." We were both kind of flabbergasted at this difference between us. We had each assumed that our church community was a place for like-minded people. Because for me, at least, a place where like-minded people are is the most comfortable place. And for me too, that's how the church community I had been raised was like. I was kind of blown away that this church attracted us both. And over time, I realized that what was really happening was that this church offered us both opportunities to engage in community in ways that were meaningful to us in our different places on our faith journeys. My engagement started with finding a safe space to explore my changing beliefs. And that safe space made it possible for me to stretch, to accept the challenges to growth that are brought by differences between us, to open to wider and wider possibilities, and eventually to embrace my role as a changemaker. There's a difference between finding a church community that will simply welcome you as you are and finding a church community that will challenge you to grow in your understanding of who you are in the world and what you find meaningful as you move through it. And between finding a church community that will offer you ways to engage with the work of making change in the world, which changes who you are. Unitarian Universalism aspires to be all of this, and this church helped me understand that. I came here as a seeker who has centered myself and my own spiritual growth. I learned here that my spiritual growth has just as much to do with living my beliefs and values as it does with discovering them. That my spiritual life is deepened by the shared work of bringing love and justice into being in the world. That my spirit thrives when I make and live a commitment to the thriving of the world and all its beings. I learned here that we can approach meaning-making and justice-seeking in many ways, and that they are deeply intertwined. And I learned here, no matter where we are on our path, we are not alone, and I'm grateful. Friends, I wish you much joy on this meaningful day. More than that, I hope that this day offers you, too, time to reflect on your own and together how being part of this church has shaped you, and on how First Unitarian has helped to shape your larger community through your commitment to your values. And I wish you at least another 150 years of embodying justice, equity, and compassion. Blessed be, friends.
History, Part 3. Remember that piece of property that we purchased at 439 Main Street? The buildings that we were renting out for income? Well, 6 years later, at a board meeting, Bob Allen, a member of this congregation then and now, proposed demolishing the rental buildings and turning the property into a memorial garden dedicated to Miriam Pleak. As is often the case with Unitarians, we discussed his proposal for a good 2 years before the decision was made to demolish the buildings. Work began in 1981 and was completed in 1983 with the stonework and plantings, and much of the work was done by congregants. The garden was officially named the Memorial Garden in memory of Miriam Pleak and all our deceased members, and dedicated in 1986, and has been an important part of the life of this congregation for the past 41 years. From 1974 to 1988, we employed a series of ministers, some serving for a year or two. In 1984, the husband and wife team of ministers, Carol Hilton and Dwight Smith, were hired as co-ministers at the May 20th, 1984 congregational meeting. They served for 2 years, resigning in March of 1986 to go to Cedar Falls, Iowa. In 1986, we celebrated the first chili cook-off, which was followed in 1987 by the first 4th of July lemonade stand. And these two events have become traditional. In 1988, we ended our revolving door of ministers for a while with the hiring of Barbara Edgecombe. And we were also lucky to hire Carol Sullivan as our church secretary. Reverend Edgecombe's tenure, which ended in 1994, was marked by some turmoil within the congregation as we began the process of participating in the Welcoming Congregation program launched by the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1989. The vast majority of us sitting here today probably cannot fathom the upheaval that occurred when we began a series of discussions on becoming a welcoming congregation. But, although it was difficult, we worked together to earn our welcoming congregation certification, and we need to renew that certification. 1989 also brought us to another major decision point with our need to make an addition to the parish hall, to make it more functional for office staff and the minister. At $120,950, the cost was considerably more than any of our past projects. Remember that the sanctuary cost us less than $3,000, and that the original parish hall building built in the mid-1950s had cost us $16,500. Luckily, we had the church equivalent of a Broadway angel among our congregants, who donated the money that was required to build the addition. The groundbreaking for that addition, which includes the offices and the kitchen, took place in 1990, with the dedication of the building addition to the Nelson Moore Parish Hall taking place on April 7th, 1991. A very generous congregant, John Bracken, paid to recondition the front doors and also proposed air conditioning for the sanctuary at a cost of $6,800. And again, the building let us know, as it always lets us know, that it needed help. There were structural problems with the sanctuary floor and the bell tower. The floor to the north of the pulpit, right there, needed to be strengthened to support the new organ. A new furnace and air conditioner were needed, and a railing was needed for the balcony. Imagine there was no balcony. And somewhere in this mix was a call to make the sanctuary handicapped accessible, which required the construction of a ramp. Also in 1991, and having nothing to do with construction, was the establishment of our first Social Concerns Committee. 16 people showed up to the first meeting to express their desire that we establish a committee to explore and discuss and take action on issues of importance, like the growing divide between rich and poor, and racism and environmental degradation. The Social Concerns/Social Justice Committee voted in 1998 to become the Faith and Action Committee, and that has been their name ever since. Other groups developed and expanded in the last 50 years. Every Wednesday for several years, members of the Unitarian Women's Alliance met in the basement to tear fabric into strips and sew the strips together at the ends and sort the strips by color into patterns for a weaver and Couts to turn into beautiful, durable rugs. They may have officially been called the Unitarian Women's Alliance, but they preferred the more colorful name, Holy Rollers and Holy Terrors. They sold their rugs at places like the county fairs, and their earnings went into a special UWA fund that they used to make small improvements in the church. From August 1999 to January 27, 2001, we celebrated our 125th anniversary, and in the fall of 1999, the Reverend Roger Bruin joined us as an extended part-time minister. And Reverend Bruin is here this morning with his wife, Kathy, to join us in our celebration. Reverend Bruin is known for having given wonderful sermons and talks throughout the area on Charles Darwin and Clarence Darrow. Ellen Christensen, wife of Stan Christensen, had written the wonderful history for the 100th anniversary celebration, and she applied herself even more during 1998 to doing the research necessary for our church's application for nomination to the National Register of Historic Places. A librarian and researcher by profession, she devoted herself, along with Christopher Boz, an associate professor of landscape architecture at Ball State, to providing broad, deep, and vivid descriptions of the building erected in 1876. Her work, and that of Mr. Boz, provided the confirmatory information that allowed the designated authority on July 26, 1999, to certify that our sanctuary met the documentation standards for registering properties in the National Register of Historic Places. And we are now also part of the Lake George Commercial Historic District, established in 2010 and revised by ordinance in 2013. There is so much more to talk about. Our monthly newsletter, The Vanguard, which was mailed to every congregant, the establishment of the Empty Circle Zen Group, which meets every Tuesday evening and Saturday morning, the Science Cafe Quarterly, which was hugely successful and which many people would like to see revived, and our twice-yearly rummage sales, which are a service to the community. We made it through the COVID years, thanks to our amazing tech team, and have expanded our presence on the internet, and we are moving forward with plans to expand our presence in the community. Our Faith and Action Ministry has been working with the IAN, the International Interfaith Action Network, on such projects as promoting and campaigning for the mobile mental health vans. We are looking to grow and have hired a consultant to help us move in that direction. Mark your calendars for October 19th. And perhaps most importantly, we are entering the third year of a contract to call ministry with Reverend Tom Bozeman. And if we work hard enough, and I have faith we will make our own history by having that fourth year and beyond be settled full-time ministry. Thank you.
Do you need to stretch? I'm Janet French, a former member, a former social worker, a graduate of Meadville Lombard Theological School, a wife, mother, grandmother, friend, and Unitarian Universalist. Thank you for including me in the invitation to speak. I was asked to share the impact the church had upon me since my spouse, Tim, our 2-year-old daughter, Kara, and I first entered these doors, rejoiced, and came in. That was October of 1990. I'll share a little from those 32 years. I'll share a song, a couple of stories, and conclude with more congratulations on this occasion and a hope for the future. In the waning years of the way back 1980s, I'd only recently heard of this church, and that due only for its regular contributions to the battered women's shelter where I served as director. And along with those checks, the church also mailed a copy of your monthly newsletter, The Vanguard. Snail mail and checks. And a hard copy of a printed newsletter. But from those two acts, I learned of a faith that emphasized deeds, not creeds, a faith where each congregant is responsible for their own beliefs and spiritual journey, but also for supporting others in their free and responsible search for truth and meaning, even when other conclusions were perhaps very different from my own. What? Like several other members of this congregation who'd found their way here, I'd grown up in a conservative faith that included doctrines of exclusion. Women could not be ministers, nor members of the GLBTQI community. Women were subordinate to the leadership of men. That's the way it was structured. That's what was called the natural order. God, men, women, children, animals, and creatures. On Sunday mornings, I watched my brothers process in and light the candles at the front of the sanctuary. I remember feeling sad that girls could not be acolytes and girls could not be ministers. But most jarring to me was the exclusivity of who could receive the Lord's Supper. Only those who had been baptized, confirmed, and were right with God, and were members of that denomination's particular sect. And there were 4 or 5 differing sects. And so those differing sects, S-E-C-T-S, could not share the Lord's Supper with mine. As a child, I had thrived in the community aspect of that faith, the after-service lemonade and donuts, the potlucks and church picnics, running around the church basement with friends from Sunday school. But as I was to find by adolescence, I could no longer reconcile the acts of exclusion on the one hand with what I was being taught in Sunday school as gospel, the words of Jesus. The first shall be last. Blessed are the poor. A little child shall lead them. And love your neighbor. Much, much later, I wondered if these thoughts might be somewhat similar to an aspect of early Unitarianism that, as I understood it, there's a fair amount of scholars in this room, but as I understood, the early Unitarianism that emerged from Christianity focused not only on the groundbreaking, heretical errors of the Trinity, but also on, at the core, on who Jesus was, proclaiming him to be a prophet and great teacher, but nonetheless fully human. Pardon me. I saw the title of an early curriculum from maybe the 50s, and it was called Jesus, the Message and the Man. That message, the way we were to be with one another, many now call beloved community, right relationship, on earth as it is in heaven, by our own hands and heart. I found this church, its people, and Unitarian Universalism is very different from my early former faith. I discovered this impact, this transformation on myself is in a song some of you may know, others may not. It's by a Unitarian Universalist from Minnesota, Peter Mayer. Everything is holy now.
When I was a boy, each week on Sunday we would go to church and pay attention to the priest. He would read the holy word and consecrate the holy bread, and everyone would kneel and bow. Today the only difference is everything is holy now. Everything is holy now. And when I was in Sunday school, we would learn about the time Moses split the sea in two, and Jesus made the water wine. And I remember feeling sad. Miracles don't happen still. Now I can't keep track, 'cause everything's a miracle. Everything everything's a miracle. Wine from water is not so small, but an even better magic trick is that anything is here at all. So the challenging thing becomes not to look for miracles, but finding where there isn't one. When holy water was rare at best, it barely wet my fingertips, but now I have to hold my breath like I'm swimming in a sea of it. Used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down, but I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. Testament, that'd be very hard to say. See another new morning come, say it's not a sacrament. I tell you that it can't be done. This morning outside I stood, saw a little red-winged bird shining like a burning bush and singing like a scripture verse. It made me want to bow my head. I remember when church let out, how things have changed since then. Everything is holy now. It used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down, but I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now.
That's the impact this church has had upon me. It used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down, but I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. The trajectory of my time here from 1990 to 2022, from age 34 to 66, now 68, necessarily included a full range of human emotions, from the joy of our daughter's child dedication and her growing up in the church, through 2 separate stints as Director of Religious Education, both hugely rewarding while also challenging, to COVID and the shutdown. For years before that, there was the joy and fun of singing in the choir, a choir that wasn't in existence when we first came. But as I learned had happened at times in the past, I helped that year to form a Christmas choir for Vespers. And then, along with others, became determined to have the choir continue throughout the rest of the church year. I see some faces here who were part of that group, who might remember. There were some talented musicians and singers, but none would agree to direct. So, knowing nothing, that may have influenced the board to seek a musician accompanist who was also a qualified choir director. Not sure, but it happened. And as the rest, as they say, is history. In seminary, focusing on religious education within the Master of Divinity degree, it was often said that a congregation is a place to practice becoming whole, becoming fully human. A congregation is a place to practice. And through those years did I practice. Even when unaware, at times lurching forward and back, but nonetheless aimed toward whole and fully human, with the help and support of fellow congregants. But what stands out for me, of course, are the people, the relationships, the appreciation for those who greeted and welcomed, who served on committees, including the Religious Education Committee and Council. Thank you. The board, those who worked in the kitchen, on building and grounds. Well, I'll leave someone out, but those who taught Sunday school or led adult RE, the kids who are here now, I heard earlier, and those who grew up in this church, those with whom I shared disagreements. You helped me. Those who were vital pillars of our congregation but have passed on, our ancestors and friends, some of whom I'm still keep in contact with. On the celebration of this 150th rededication of this church, the impact escapes words, except thank you. Thank you to those on whose shoulders we stand. Thank those of you who will carry on, practicing together, becoming whole and fully human. Because for me, the impact of this congregation is life-saving. Holy now. May together we make it so. Amen, and blessed be.
Now is the time in our service for the offering. Let us take a moment to honor the ancestors of this church, the people who first came together to create a home for liberal religion here in Hobart, who worked to raise money for a building, who sat in committee meetings and created bylaws, who chopped and marinated and baked for potlucks, who painted and weeded and pounded nails and washed countless dishes, who gathered to worship, to learn, to grieve, to heal, to serve, to build justice, to transform their lives and this world. We are the recipients of an incredible gift and a beautiful vision. Let us do our part to keep this congregation strong, vital, and thriving for the generations to come. The morning offering will now be greatly received. For your gifts, we are profoundly grateful. And please now join in singing the closing hymn, number 1028 in the Teal hymnal. It's not Spirit of Life, it is the Fire of Commitment. Please stand as you are willing and able. Thank you.
offer up these closing words. Surely all of creation is in this place, and I did not know it. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of all the eternal, and this is the gate of heaven.
been a great time. Thank you for coming. I hope you'll plan to stay as long as you possibly can this evening. We have a party in the garden, you know. And so we're going to invite you all, if you can, to exit by the back door. You can keep the ramps clear for those who need them. And now, if I would like to invite my friend, Reverend Roger Bruin, to join me and all of you in the extinguishing of the chalice. Oh. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. This we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Thank you, Sandy. All right, party on, Garth. Let's go. Congratulations.